And I kind of sat there thinking, wow, these guys are geniuses.
Everyone thought that was absolutely fine until one day they realized that it wasn't absolutely fine. So what happened?
Okay, everyone, welcome to episode 5 of the Paragoni podcast. My name is Robert Yo, and as usual, I'm joined by my fellow co-hosts, Robin, Richard, and Simon. This is going to be a conversational episode because we're focusing on the topic of fraud, specifically corporate fraud. To be clear, none of us have worked in the legal profession, so this is our perspectives from our experience and where we currently sit. The dictionary definition of fraud is wrongful or criminal deception intended to result in financial or personal gain. A person or thing intended to deceive others, typically by unjustifiably claiming or being credited with accomplishments or qualities. So that legal definition, no doubt, will vary country by country, but this is where we are here in the UK. Now, thinking back in our careers, we've worked for 20, 25 years, 30 years even in our careers so far. And there's been some significant corporate frauds that have taken place during that time. So thinking back to the dot-com bubble, we had things like Enron, which we're going to touch on. There was Madoff's Ponzi scheme and WorldCom were three of the biggest examples. And then more recently, there are ones like FTX, allegedly, Wirecard, the German electronic payments company, Wells Fargo, set impossibly high sales goals that resulted in thousands of fake customer accounts. And let's not forget Volkswagen and cheating emission standards. And that resulted in substantial fines, many billions of fines in the US and beyond. So there's lots of examples. And you know what? They keep happening. Even though the penalties for getting caught have become increasingly severe, with executives and board directors now being more personally liable than ever before for control failures while they're on charge. Now, in today's podcast episode, we'll attempt to find the common themes and reasons for the corporate fraud and unpeel this very complex onion. So I'm going to pass you over to Simon, who's going to get us started on this far-reaching topic.
I think the starting point for this is fraud is really, it's almost a classic topic for lazy thinking. Because when a fraud is uncovered, it often looks obvious in hindsight, and that's maybe a lazy assumption by me. But you look at a lot of these and think, well, actually, that was probably too good to be true. We sort of touched on allegedly FTX and some of the others, but people still do fall for these frauds. They kind of create them so they know they can get away with it, and people pile in, investing in things that in retrospect were too good to be true. And I think that's for you and me. We sort of touched on Enron there. We both got experience of having worked there, so we can kind of dig into some of the detail on that. The starting point for me on this, and I think it's such a useful quote. It's a great heuristic for lots of things in life, but particularly it's relevant to frauds, which is Charlie Munger's quote, which is show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcomes. And you can reverse that as well by saying, well, look, if you know the outcomes, you can figure out the incentives as well. Enron's a useful reference point because even people who think they're really smart fall for frauds. So Rob and I both worked at Enron. We thought it was a great company to go and work for. Turns out it was not quite as great as we thought it was. And Rob, I think you once said to me that the challenge with having Enron on our CV was we need to balance things out to show that we were senior enough to have an interesting role, but junior enough not to be kind of directly or indirectly responsible for what went wrong. So we can go into that as well.
Yes, we were definitely not involved with the fraud. Just to be clear, we were in the UK.
Yeah, exactly. And look, and I think just your intro as well touched on some interesting areas like crypto investing, careers. We'll get into kind of regulation as well. But I think the key thing you mentioned is, fraud's on the increase. It's not just actual fraud, but it's also the focus from the media, the police, auditors, politicians, everybody. We're going into tough times economically. That's when people are both more motivated to commit frauds, and also the frauds become more obvious when the cash runs out. So the question is, how do people realize what's going on? How do you find out? How do you figure these things out?
So there's two things that jumped out there. There is this point about, is fraud increasing? The point about incentives, you've mentioned several times, the Charlie Munger quote was awesome. But it's like, well, what incentives are we really talking about here that appear to make people go down these paths that maybe don't begin as fraud, but inevitably they end up as fraud? So I think the incentives is a really interesting point, because I think that is a common theme that we're going to see throughout.
So when we're talking about incentives here, that's a really interesting question. So let's unpack it. So when we're talking about incentives, there's the people are generally motivated by power, kind of autonomy, money. I think are three of the key things there. So a lot of this comes down to that motivation. Now, if you're inside a company committing frauds, you probably not got so much power, maybe got enough autonomy to actually go and grab some money. Maybe that's what you're doing. But a lot of these frauds are, I don't necessarily subscribe to kind of great man or great woman theory of history, but a lot of the investment community does. So when you've got those incentives, you've got almost a charismatic founder who's got a new idea, who's coming up with that new idea. People want to give them money. And that's quite a dangerous thing to be, because in a lot of these cases, it's going to be a great opportunity. Somebody's found a new market and they can really go for it, and investors don't want to miss out. But actually, it's quite difficult to tell up front what really might happen here. The example there is obviously a lot of new, I think Benedict Evans talks about a lot of new technology starts out as a toy. It's quite difficult to tell actually that the iPhone or the Apple Watch would really be very, very useful. It did turn out to be, but there are other examples where they haven't been. Well, that's not necessarily fraud. That's just somebody coming up with a new product that didn't quite work out. There's a very good example, I think, of Theranos, where Elizabeth Holmes came up with what looked like a fantastic new product. Maybe she believed it was a fantastic new product, but it didn't work. Was that a fraud at the beginning, or did it become a fraud later on because her and her team's over enthusiasm then led into that? So I don't know, but that for me is the incentive piece. It's power, autonomy, money.
Yeah, I think that's right, isn't it? It is, there's money, so it's the classic Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So once you get above the lower levels of just security, so food and light and heat and a home, you then get very much into the money and ego, and therefore status really, really matters. And I get a sense that will be a common theme. Certainly money will be common throughout, but also I suspect there's a status thing as well. You being the CEO of an organization, or being perceived to be successful, and therefore on the front of lots and lots of magazines, and then put on a pedestal, which 2 years later you fall off. I joined Enron in '99, and then ultimately it went in bankruptcy, or Chapter 11 in the US in, I think it was November, December of 2001. So therefore it was .com, right? .com boom, bubble, bust. So the optimism, the unbridled optimism, which maybe we'll find is a common theme throughout a lot of these frauds in the broader environment and the broader markets, was just massive. There was article after article about Enron and about what people wanting to work there, and case studies. I suspect they've all been deleted now from Forbes and Harvard Business Review and Inc. and Time, etc. But that was the environment. Everybody wanted a job at Enron, and it was super exciting. And here in London, we were a part of Enron Europe, which focused on energy commodity trading, right? So power in continental Europe, UK, natural gas, oil. It then expanded to metals. It then expanded to other products, which Simon, you joined credit, I think, right? And then it had, eventually it was stoking the market to say it was going to trade broadband bandwidth, and that's when I think was peak mania, and the stock price got a massive boom. So why join? Because it's super exciting, far more exciting than a bank, right? You can do the same job for people like Simon and me as chartered accountants. Our typical route would be into the finance function, the control function, the risk function. And so that's what the route I went to. So I actually didn't work at a bank before Enron. I subsequently spent the vast majority of my career at banks after Enron, but it was super exciting. The smartest people worked there. It was really dynamic and just not boring. And I thoroughly enjoyed every day of every week of every month that I worked there. But it was an aggressive, fast-paced, fast-charging environment that in the final months you could see the credit spiral and circle looming fast. But in the beginning it was super, super, super exciting.
Yeah, no, I agree. And that's why I joined as well. It was doing something different. It was doing something exciting. I was in a relatively dull kind of credit trading part of the business, so buying and selling kind of corporate debts, which felt to me like a kind of a proper, in inverted commas, we'll come on to why we were doing it, whether we should have been doing it, but it felt like a proper investment banking type business. But on the other part of the business, I used to go to kind of weekly sort of sales and finance meetings where, I'm going to misremember this, but it was something like we're going to deliver raw alumina and electricity into Guangzhou, and then we're going to collect the finished aluminium out of Shanghai, and we're going to mark them both to market and make millions. And I kind of sat there thinking, wow, these guys are geniuses. They also had an idea of building a virtual power station. So what does a power station do? Well, it takes in gas and it generates electricity. You don't actually need to go and have a power station to go and get the economic equivalent of owning a power station. So there's this idea of a virtual power station that actually I can't bother to go and build one myself. Enron, can you construct this virtual thing for me? Also, and this is where the genius and the danger of Enron came in, is that you can buy a power station, a virtual power station. But if you think power stations are too expensive, you can also now sell a power station you don't own. Or if you have a power station, you can sell a real power station. You can sell a virtual power station now. You don't own any power stations. And it's that kind of genius in a way of thinking about things that was the real thing in Enron. The challenge was probably twofold, I think, was one of which is they had access. I mean, we're talking they went bust in December 2001, the dot-com bubble, the NASDAQ bubble started bursting in March 2000s. So they probably had a bit of runway left on the cash they borrowed. But essentially, there was so much free money out there. Investors switched off their antenna. It just wants to pump more and more money into what was actually a very risky business.
What I still don't really understand is what a virtual power station is, and how Enron were trying to, manage a portfolio of businesses that didn't exist. How did they do that? How did they get away with that? How did they end up in a situation where they felt that was a thing to be doing?
So when you bought a virtual power station, you bought the spread, so the difference between an input price, which is the gas, and the output price of the power, and this whole complex machinery to convert one to the next. And that had a value. For the energy companies that bought these, it stopped them from needing to get planning permission, get all the approvals to build one, then run it and maintain it for the next 20 years.
How do you make money from that?
So one thing we haven't explained, commodities get physically delivered. Just Enron sourced it from elsewhere. They sourced it from the continent. They sourced it from Drax power station. They sourced it from a nuclear power station. There is a marketplace. They should never have been allowed to market to market. So what that means is they valued that, I think we said 20 years of a series of options and the spread between the gas and the power price. So they marked to market it and said, that's worth, I'm making up a number, 100 million euros. And that 100 million euros goes to profits because they've marked it to market.
How do you register, or how do you get away with not registering?
So they were audited. The auditors were pushed aggressively by the organization, and those auditors ultimately signed off that this was a legitimate treatment under the US accounting standards, the UK accounting standards, and international accounting standards, which have subsequently turned out to be wrong, and the auditors no longer exist, right? They were Arthur Andersen. So that's just one example of a great idea that ultimately wasn't, from an accounting perspective, allowed. It is, and it was complex financial engineering. Let's be clear, Enron aside, this goes on all over the place in different forms, and especially for long-term inflation hedging for our pensions or whatever. And auditors and organizations are always pushing the envelope as to what they can mark to market and how they can value it.
So everyone knew that these were virtual power stations. There was nothing really here. It was just trading, right? It was just trading between the differences of commodity prices, essentially. Everyone thought that was absolutely fine until one day they realized that it wasn't absolutely fine. So what happened? Did the house of cards just collapse and the money ran out, or what actually happened?
That was exactly it. I mean, I'd probably answer the question. I'd say it was slightly the other way around, in that the money ran out and then the house of cards collapsed. But essentially, that was exactly it. So what happened was the dot-com bubble, which started popping in March 2001. Enron got into serious trouble in sort of June, July 2001. And I think, like with lots of these things, when the money's available, you can go and do everything. And then eventually people start to ask questions. Now, the piece there was that they started trading bandwidth, because that was the cool thing then, right? It was the start of the internet age. That's an amazing thing. Let's go and do that. And they started to do, goes back to what I said about kind of bad bets. They spent all this money, and the money wasn't then coming back in, because they bought things that were too expensive, bought things that weren't generating a return. And it ultimately got to the point where they couldn't raise any more funds from people. And that's when they went into administration. The simple businesses there that were profitable, that were made complex. And there were other businesses, like we just touched on, the virtual power station, that were deliberately complex. Now, as soon as you get into that level of complexity, it's really difficult for people to understand. And actually, it's much easier to hide frauds there as well, because people just don't understand it.
Questions started to get asked by analysts, right? Financial analysts questioning Jeff Skilling, who was the CEO at the time. And he could not explain and got very frustrated publicly trying to answer their questions, which is, you've got all these amazing numbers, but where's the cash and how are you generating them? And then the level of suspicion starts to rise as well. And there is definitely an understanding that Enron is pushing the boundaries and is aggressive. And that, it is legitimate to be aggressive on your accounting treatment, but basically it got pushed so far, and then the complexity layered on top of the complexity on top of the complexity, that you've got all these accounting profits, but it comes back to not enough cash. And as the questions start going, get more tougher and tougher, we're in the context now that actually the dot-com bubble was burst. So people are running away from complexity again because they don't understand it. They go into defensive mode, and therefore the money disappears. And then very quickly, they're using the house of cards. The cards start falling over rapidly, and then suddenly the emperor's wearing no clothes. And I think I threw lots of sayings in there in once.
Yeah, it's usually some kind of unexpected event that catches them out, isn't it? That, it may not even be directly related to their business, but it, in the case of the money markets drying up in another area, caused the knock-on effect into their particular area, which is, that's not the first time that's happened, and probably not going to be the last time, but it's just staggering that it continues to happen.
When this was actually going on and it was being successful, did anyone, be it the auditors, the company themselves, the regulators, did anyone consider that this was fraud? Or was it only when they looked back after it all collapsed that they went, do you know what, this was actually fraud? At what point did they actually establish that this was fraud? Was it while it was happening or after it happened?
It's a really good question. I'd say, and I think this, Simon, I think this is probably consistent with your views from London. And this is a key difference, right? London, and it comes back to the silos that we talk about. It had some simple businesses and it had some complex businesses, but ultimately it was in its own silo. That therefore we and certainly at the levels we're operating at much earlier in our careers, we had no view as to perhaps the broader cash flow isn't there, and therefore everything's fine. We knew we were very aggressive, but that's what you do, right? You want to be pushing the boundaries of the rules and regulations, but as long as you stay inside them, then that's totally legitimate. And that's where you get reassurance that your auditors, who are supposed to be independent, right, will push back and keep you in within that guardrail. So I'd say from our side, look, there's lots of complexity being added onto it, and some of the businesses we're operating in weren't making money, but others were. But I do believe in the US, there was certainly, wasn't there a whistleblower or something that came out? I just can't remember if the sequence of events, if that happened after the bankruptcy or if that started before.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that's a really good question, Robin. I think I don't think Enron was a fraud from the beginning, but all the things that Rob and I have talked about were there from the beginning. So the need for cash, the aggressive expansion, the incentives to staff, the exciting place to work, all those things, they were there from early days. My guess would be the wheels started to come off probably in the mid-90s. So certainly by about 97, I think Enron was, in retrospect, was struggling, but nobody noticed, or if anybody did notice, that the questions weren't asked until a couple of years later. And then Enron was very aggressive on its accounting. It hid a lot of its the money it had borrowed. It hid a lot of its activities. It hid a lot of the assets it had bought off its own balance sheet. So they're in separate legal entities that Enron ultimately controlled, but they tried to hide it from analysts, tried to hide it from investors and from lenders. So I think from probably about 97 to 2000-ish, there was a problem, but Enron was very successful at hiding it. It took till probably early 2001 for people to really start asking questions. Could people have noticed earlier? I think some people did. I think the chorus of voices got louder and louder, but I think there was an aggressive attempt to hide, A, how much Enron had borrowed, and B, how bad things were going. And that's a failure of management, of course it was, but it's also a failure of the regulators, failure of the auditors, failure of the internal control functions. People should have picked this up. I don't necessarily want to say it was obvious in hindsight, etc., but actually there were enough clues, I think, that people should have noticed. But then ultimately, I didn't. So I took a job there. I thought it was great. So I'm criticising myself as much as I am anyone else there.
It sounds like it was never actually their intention to do this. They kind of were allowed to get away with it through bad auditing and bad regulations and stuff like that. And then they found themselves in a minefield. And once they were in that minefield, they had no choice but to keep playing this game that got them into the minefield in the first place. And even though they knew that this was really bad and they shouldn't be doing it, they had no choice but to keep doing it for the survival of the company.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely spot on. I think it's a common theme in a lot of the frauds that corporate collapses that Rob mentioned in the intro. And I think there's a really good comparison to Elizabeth Holmes. Did she have a real business in the beginning? Well, maybe she did, maybe she didn't, but certainly after a bit she realized it wasn't working, but everybody believed in her and everybody wants to give her money, and you keep going and it's hoping something's going to come up, which I think, Robin, you said there's that piece around what you start with, maybe enthusiasm, you get into over enthusiasm, and then all of a sudden something started to go wrong, and we can make it back. So a lot of frauds aren't those deliberate Ponzi schemes, but it's you end up in that same scenario where you need more and more cash to kind of keep the plate spinning.
But if something is too complicated as a business, it doesn't pass the smell test, does it? I think in the case of Enron, it sounds like there were lots of really good bits of that business that were hugely, successful and valuable, but they muddied the water with these bits of the business that weren't. And somebody somewhere should have, really literally had it like, this is a product, and this product has, stroke business really is like a standalone entity, and this is its profit and loss, not muddied by any other nonsense going on in any other parts of the business. And I'm a big fan of keeping things very clear and simple. But obviously, if you're committing fraud, you do the opposite, right? You muddy it so it's too complex, and people don't delve deeper because they go, I just don't understand it, I haven't got the time, and they go, okay, I trust this person, and move on, right?
There's a word for that, isn't there? You come across bike shedding. That kind of idea that if you're in a board meeting I think the original example was given as there's a nuclear power station, you need to approve some spend on it and say it's going to cost 10 billion or something. Well, that's kind of really complicated. Not many people in the room are going to really understand it. You might just nod it through, but actually the item 2 on the agenda is, okay, we need to have a new bike shed for the employees at work. So what colour should we paint the roof? Well, everybody's got an opinion on that. And that's what I think you see in quite a lot of boards, in my experience, is actually the really complex stuff people just shy away from. And it's hard because it's actually hard. You've got to really sit there and think about it, understand the detail. But these other things over here, okay, great. And then the third item on the agenda is, okay, well, what sandwiches are we going to have afterwards? I mean, that's the challenge with a lot of this stuff. The complexity wasn't introduced so they could commit the frauds. But when they did decide to commit the fraud, the complexity hit us, and that was super helpful. And I think coming on to some of the other examples where, again, going back to Theranos, we mentioned that. Wirecard, Rob also mentioned, that's a real highlight of those, that you make something so complicated, so much of a black box, you can't understand it, and therefore it's much easier to hide what's going on. Robin, we touched on Theranos, and I never quite know how we would pronounce it. So Elizabeth Holmes's blood testing business, which turned out to be a fraud eventually. On that one, what are the similarities? What are the differences to Enron? And in particular, do you think that was a fraud from the start? Because I've always thought it probably was.
And so obviously Elizabeth Holmes, she was 19 years old. She was at Stanford University. I can't remember what she was studying, but she had this idea to revolutionize blood testing, essentially. She had this ambition to make blood testing from a sort of a tiny little vial, a nanotainer, as she called it. But even though her professor, or a professor at Stanford who knew about this kind of science, told her that this was not going to work, she went ahead. So you could argue that at that moment it was off to a crazy start, right? But she still inherently believed that this was possible. So at that point, I don't think in her head she thought this was fraud. I think in her head she thought she was generally going to revolutionize blood testing. And so obviously she manages to raise some money. There are the investor book is filled with very famous people like Rupert Murdoch, Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, and various others. early signs, their early development, they had some interesting technology which they used to showcase. They did the fake it till you make it technology showcases, which was so typical of Silicon Valley. We're not going to go back to the sort of the 2000.com where this was very prevalent, but it was the same kind of setup of let's show something as if it was working, even though it isn't quite working yet, in the hope that one day we will get it to work.
I think, Robin, that's fair enough. You fake it until you make it is fine, as long as you're explaining to people it is a demo. I'm showing you what it will be like. This isn't real. Parts of it may be real, but ultimately you've got to be very clear with investors about what is and isn't real.
And that's exactly the difference here, is they didn't have the technology that was working, or even a proof that it would work. All they had at this point was a hope that it would work. And so it was, if you can say that because you hope something will work, that it's therefore not fraud, then at this particular moment in the Theranos story, it wasn't quite yet fraud. As they continued, they got more and more investment, and because the people who had already invested were very credible people, and had done no due diligence at all, because they just believed that everyone seemed to fall in love with Elizabeth Holmes when they met her, and so they just invested in her because she was sort of promoted as the female equivalent of Steve Jobs from very early on. So everyone who came to invest looked at who had already invested and went, oh, well, they're very credible. Therefore, this must be great. Therefore, I shall invest. I think Rupert Murdoch ended up investing $125 million on that basis of believing that everyone who already gone in was so credible that he just didn't bother doing due diligence. I don't know whether that's his normal style or what, I don't know, but that was the case here. So, but there was a point later on where they knew the technology just wasn't going to work, but they carried on anyway. And it started to become not a normal Ponzi scheme, but something a bit similar to Ponzi scheme. They needed to start to create the appearance of a business that they didn't have. So they started telling investors that they had contracts with like the MOD or the American equivalent, like the Army and stuff, and that their testing units were being carried on helicopters and things like that for the armed forces in America. And they started then, and no one called them out on it to begin with, and so they then used those stories to then go and sell Walgreens on the idea of having sort of walk-in blood testing centres, and Walgreens invested a load of money into this. But by this point, I think it's quite clear to say that they kind of knew that this wasn't going to work, or at least scientists who were working at Theranos had realized that this just was not going to work reliably. And there was a sort of a penny drop moment where one of the scientists who worked for Theranos was like, well, these vials aren't actually big enough to contain enough blood that will contain enough cells of a particular disease that it will ever be detected in the Theranos machine. Because the parts per million that this disease will have in blood is so small that in this blood nanotainer, the chances of actually having a single cell of that disease in that blood nanotainer are very, very small indeed. And so there was a point at which Elizabeth Holmes, kind of knew that the technology was working. She was still hoping it was going to work. And she used that hope to sell what ultimately was a lie. And that actually resulted in, obviously, the inevitable collapse of Theranos. But when she was charged with fraud, she wasn't sorry, I just need to back up a bit there. Many patients were given false diagnoses, both positive and negative. People were told they had terminal diseases like cancer and stuff like that, and they were not ill at all. And on the flip side, people who were ill had their diagnoses missed. But interestingly, when it went to court, the fraud charges against sort of lack of patient care, I don't know what the correct term for that is. She wasn't charged with, well, she was charged with those, but she was found not guilty for those. What she was found guilty for was essentially the wire fraud, the taking investment under false pretenses. Theranos did do trials in inverted commas, but they faked the results, and so you can't really argue that that wasn't fraud. That was definitely fraud, because coming back to your point about, fake it till you make it, so you can showcase a pre-canned demo or a made-up demo of something that is actually going to work. There was never any evidence that this was ever going to work at all. And so but the key difference here for me is when, say Apple, for example, came on stage and showcased a new product that they don't know is ever really going to work. I suppose Facebook may be doing that with Meta, but let's stick with the Apple thing. They come up with some new sort of iPhone that they've no idea whether the technology can actually really work, and they showcase it and stuff like that. And then they use that to raise money, to raise their share price. And ultimately it never delivers, and people forget about it in time because no one got hurt. The difference between that and Theranos is people got hurt. People's lives were messed around with in terms of their medical diagnosis. And this wasn't just about stock market manipulation. This was actually, in the end, about taking money from people, high-end investors. And it wasn't really VCs. Most of the money came from individuals as opposed to funds. You had high net worth individuals like Rupert Murdoch and George Shultz and Henry Kissinger and people like that were investing, and it was investing on sort of almost a nepotism basis of, that I trust that person, therefore I will invest. And it was this massive house of cards built on trust
and assumptions.
Yeah,
isn't it?
that's right. And ultimately they ran out of runway because what really started it was the whole Walgreens collapse. When things just weren't going well there, and then it came to light that all of her lies about the army, and then obviously someone tipped off John Carreyrou. I think it was actually George Shultz's grandson that tipped off John Carreyrou, who was the journalist who then investigated the story and blew it up from there. But the key difference here is you don't fake it till you make it with medicine, right? Or medical devices. Whether you should or shouldn't be doing that with technology per se is a slightly different conversation. But and that does definitely happen, right? We definitely know that happens. But people don't get hurt. People really got hurt with this.
When you invest money in the sums that these people were talking about, 20 million, 100 million here, you really would be wanting to see, even if you didn't do the due diligence on the medical side, you'd want to see a contract, right? You'd want to see a heads of terms letter that outlined that, for instance, the army had signed this contract, right? I mean,
she faked all this stuff.
She fraudulently created these documents.
Yeah. She faked documents. She took logos from things and put them onto documents that were bullshit documents.
All right, so I guess one of the things about Theranos, in comparison to others, is that at what point did the fraud start within Theranos, and what point did they know it was fraud and then continue to double down on the fraud?
I think it's a really interesting question. I think when she was at university, being told by sort of science professors that this couldn't work, or medical professors, I can't remember exactly the type of professors. Was that fraud, or was she just, did she, being 19 and naive, was she, I know better than you kind of thing? That's kind of hubris. That's fine to go and start a company, a bootstrapped company based on hubris and hope. So I don't think that was necessarily the point of fraud. I think for me, the fraud came much later on when they started faking results in order to win business and to win more investment. And then they started lifting logos off documents and putting them onto sort of spurious or even fake documents to sort of prove what their business was about to potential investors. I mean, they started to not give responses to investors as they got increasingly anxious as to what was going on. They started actually acting with quite severe animosity towards some of their investors, because they literally had nothing to say to the investors that would be truthful. So I think by that point it was definitely fraud. But did it start as intended fraud, or did they end up in a situation where they were like, oh my God, we've raised whatever it was, like $700-800 million. We don't really have a business here. Nothing's really working. What do we do? I think by that point, it was definitely fraud. And I think the presence of Sunny Balwani, who was both her partner and the chief operating officer, his presence didn't help in terms of keeping them on the straight and narrow. I think his presence actually helped them have the appetite for doubling down on the fraud. But I still believe that Elizabeth Holmes continued all the way through to believe that they would get to a place where this technology worked, even though she was clearly wrong, because the whole premise of the technology was wrong. I think she really believed it all the way through, and she was just kind of like faking it till she made it, and she just found herself in ever increasingly awkward situations. And so I think the fraud, but it was towards the end, the last couple of years really, when everything started to fall apart, it was fully fraud by then, and they needed to sort of raise the flag, but they didn't.
Yeah. So I've been kind of quiet, but so far with this conversation, but I 100% agree that, look, this wasn't fraud at the start. This was a startup. This was a pushing the boundaries. This was being entrepreneurial. So of course you're going to get people saying, no, you can't do that, or you can't do that, you can't do that. But very clearly at some point it transitioned. And in fact, I'm sure the court transcripts, etc., will clarify exactly that point. What really jumps out to me, and I think this is a common thread with other frauds that we see and other, not necessarily even technical frauds, but it's this point that optimism supplants critical thinking. And that could be the founder themselves, it could be their board that could be at fault there, it could be the investors, it could be the analysts, and it can be the employees as well. And we touched on with Enron that perhaps it's difficult for employees to be critical and actually are subject to lazy thinking when within an organization. And I'm going to paraphrase something from another company, but a book I've written about another company, which was WeWork. And I think this 100% applies here, and be interested in what you all think, which is, and I'm going to paraphrase it, the rise and fall of the company, WeWork in that case, or Theranos here, was enabled by a collision of forces. A person, the CEO, characterized by charisma, unbridled optimism, and astute salesmanship, meets an entire financial system primed to fall under their spell. And then when those forces collide, everything works together and people think like a herd. So we get to this point that it's groupthink. I think that applied here with Theranos. People wanted to believe it, optimism. I think it applies with WeWork, not necessarily a fraud. I think it applied with Enron back in the dot-com bubble, boom and bust as well. And I suspect it applies much more broadly.
No, I totally agree. The number of people within Theranos that if you took them out of that context and asked them objectively whether this was going to work, would have known that it wasn't going to work, but they were riding this wave and they suddenly had this sort of tunnel vision of, yes, we can make it work. And there were only sort of 3 or 4 people in that entire company that actually decided they needed to raise the flag. One of them was George Shultz's grandson. One of them was it Rebecca Chung or whatever her name was. And the other one was the scientist who ultimately committed suicide. I can't remember his name off the top of my head. But you've got a handful of people in a cast of hundreds who, without them, it would have carried on for longer and longer and longer.
The only question I've got left on Theranos then is how. So Rob and I talked about Enron, and it was very compartmentalized. There was some simple businesses, they added complexity. There were complex businesses. It was difficult for anybody to see the full picture. What was that like at Theranos, do you think? Was it the kind of what was going on in the fraud was really tightly controlled, or did a lot of people know what was going on and kind of bought into the fake it till you make it?
It's difficult to know. It's difficult to know actually, because none of the documentaries or books really cover what most of the people knew. That they all dwell on the sort of the stars of the story, if you like. So it's not really sure. But what we do know is that Elizabeth Holmes became increasingly protective about information flow around the company, and so it was very likely that a lot of people in the company had no idea that they were working for a company that was increasingly a sham.
There were 100 employees at Theranos, so it's not like Enron, which probably had many thousands. People would have surely been talking at drinks after work or around the water cooler or whatever, right? It seems hard to believe that, the majority of the people didn't know that it was going to be unsuccessful. but probably just carrying on turning up for their, high salaries and hope their stock options might be worth something one day.
I don't know about that, because staying to the end of something that is later then proven that you must have known was a fraud, I can't exactly see that as being a good career.
Yeah, true.
And so I don't know. I don't know if we know enough about what really was going on behind closed doors in terms of sort of crowd communication. But what we do know is that there were the people who were the people who were closest to the sort of coalface, if you like, were the ones that raised the flag, because they realized that it just wasn't going to work. It's thanks to those few people and whoever it was that alerted John Carreyrou to it, that the House of Cards sort of collapsed when it did, because it would have eventually collapsed anyway, right? But she might have raised another $300-400-500 million first.
Sounds to me like a lot of this is just the sort of the unexpected outcome of a series of complex events, right? She didn't set out to kind of have this fraud happen. It just kind of, all these things happen. What's sort of your take on it?
Yeah, I agree. It's the law of unintended consequences, right? In both the case of Enron and in the case of Theranos there that we've looked at, they both started off with good intentions. Enron was around for quite a long time. I'm not entirely sure how long. Theranos, despite being told by professors and other experts that the idea was fraud, being a 19-year-old girl full of excitement and hubris and everything, very similar to other startups, tech startups. They go, I know better than you, and very often they turn out to be right, actually, but not in this case. But I don't think in either of these situations either company set out to be fraudulent. They ended up sort of in a corner where things weren't going according to the plan, and they had so much money on the line, their only option became to double down, and at that point it became fraudulent.
Right, that's really interesting. Thank you. Yeah, and I think, look, just coming back to what we said at the start of the episode, which is this, come up with a few heuristics, a few quotes, but I do genuinely think the kind of the Charlie Munger quote of "show me the incentives, I'll show you the outcomes" is so important here. Whenever you're doing diligence on anything, an investment, a career, whatever it is, try and figure out. You may be wrong, probably be wrong, but at least you're trying to think about things and actually trying to understand kind of what's actually going on here. And in terms of sort of this episode, and I guess going back over my career, you kind of end up trying to question everything, I think. But then the problem with question everything is you end up going mad, so that you don't believe anything about anybody ever. So I think that the challenge on this one is sort of figuring out, well, where do we take this knowledge? Rob, what's your main takeaway from what we've discussed?
So my main takeaway is that the grass is always greener on the side that is fertilized with bullshit. So that applies whether we're investing our personal wealth, buying a house, looking for another job. And I think here, this really, really shows up with the investors, the so-called sophisticated investors into some of these companies, and it applies to the employees of these companies. It certainly applies to the C-suite and boards of these companies, that they should be absolutely challenging things. So that's the sort of heuristic I have, and apply when thinking about things. If it sounds too good to be true, it probably is, because it's probably fertilized with that stuff.
Rich, you sort of talked about some of the kind of the investment opportunities you've looked at. What would be your sort of takeaway? How to think about these kind of things?
You've got to do your due diligence, and I think over the last 10 years, there's been, particularly in the startup space, investors have not had enough time to do due diligence, because there's been so many investors looking at startups. They would literally go into a meeting, hear the idea from the founders, and go, here's your term sheet, I've got to invest. If I don't, somebody else is going to invest. That's all cooled off now, and people are now taking weeks to do the due diligence again, rather than a day or hours, or not at all. So I think, yes, you've got to do your due diligence as best you can do, representative of the amount of money you're investing, right? If you're investing tens of millions of dollars, then the due diligence should be much deeper, and you should potentially bring in external experts to take a look at it if it's something outside of your expertise. But I also think that, then this applies not only to startups as well, but also to the bigger companies. Your board has got to be, a proper board, not something that's filled with, career non-execs who just turn up and nod and sign things. It's got to be full of people that are really challenging the CEO, of the business on what's going on. And you've got to be having proper reporting in place for these. I see too many startups who don't, report in words and not in graphs to boards, and it's very difficult. And they do it with investors when they're looking for the next round of funding. They'll say, we're doing this, but at no point do they go back and compare what it was they said in the previous funding round was their target. So they do need to be held to account a lot more by their boards. And I think, that's critical. And that's something obviously that should be happening on a regular basis, not these 6 monthly boards that some startups have. They need to be monthly, at most quarterly.
That makes sense. Thanks. And Robin, what do you think?
I think there are a lot of companies which start off with good intentions, end up sort of, there's a point where their sort of bravado becomes fraud. And if you're just a tech company building software or building a new device or something and it goes bang, it just disappears. It's considered to be a bad bet, even though there might have been quite a lot of fraud wrapped up in there because no one got hurt. The difference between those companies and companies like Theranos, Enron, and most recently FTX and some of the other companies like that, people are getting hurt, whether it be financially, physically, whatever, not just the investors, but also the consumers. And I think at that point, there's a lot more scrutiny and something is considered to be fraud, whereas other things which are actually built on fraud are just written off as bad debt.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. And I think, my final thoughts on it is just go back to something that Rich said, which is the sort of the worst place you can be as an investor is just to sort of reverse of what Robin said as well, is it's the fear of missing out, right? If you're really worried about missing out on something because loads of other people are in an investment or doing something, or this looks cool, or let's go and put our money to work there, you just got to take a step back and just go, hang on a second, they may be geniuses, but herd following is always dangerous. So yeah, just be careful of fear of missing out.
Thank you, everyone. That's a wrap for us. Again, these are complex subjects that we try to cover, and we always run out of time. So thank you to my fellow co-hosts, Richard, Simon, and Robin. And we all look forward to welcoming you to our next episode. And please remember to like and subscribe to the Paragoni podcast. Bye.